They called me into the conference room on my 34th birthday, and my manager, Richard, said we're going in a different direction, and HR placed a separation agreement on the table, and I looked at the document, and I looked at Richard, and I thought about the fact that I had spent 6 years building the client relationships that accounted for 40% of this office's revenue, and I thought about the birthday cake my team had left on my desk that morning that I had not yet eaten, and I thought about the thing I had been quietly negotiating for 4 months that nobody in this building knew about, and I signed the separation agreement, and I shook Richard's hand, and I collected my things, and I walked out of the building, and I sat in my car, and I looked up at the glass facade of the building I had just been escorted out of. And I thought, you have no idea what you just did. And 6 months later, I sat in a different conference room with a different set of documents, and I signed my name as the new owner of the commercial property that housed this exact building and every other tenant in it, including the company that had fired me on my birthday, and Richard's office was now technically in a building that belonged to me, and I had not planned it that way, but I was not going to pretend I was not satisfied. Hey everyone, so good to have you here today. And if you're brand new, wow, you really did land on a good one. This story has been sitting inside me for almost a year, and I think I finally have enough distance from it to tell it the way it deserves to be told. So get comfortable. My name is Serena Blake, and I am 34 years old, well, 35 now, and 6 months ago I was fired from a marketing agency where I had worked for 6 years, where I had built and personally managed a client portfolio that generated 40% of the entire office's annual revenue. And they did it on my birthday, which I want to say clearly was not intentional on their part. It was simply a terrible coincidence of scheduling that became the detail everyone remembered, and the birthday part is not what made it significant. What made it significant was what I had been quietly working on for 4 months before it happened that they had absolutely no knowledge of. I had joined Meridian Marketing Group 6 years earlier as a mid-level account manager and had built my way to senior director through a combination of genuine work and what I can only describe as a very specific skill for understanding what clients actually needed versus what they said they needed. And the clients I managed were not small accounts. They were the kind of accounts that have their own internal marketing teams and their own expectations and their own complicated approval chains, and I had navigated all of that for 6 years and had retained every client I had ever been assigned and had grown several of them significantly, and the agency's revenue from my portfolio was not a secret. It showed up in every quarterly review and every year-end report, and Richard, my manager, had used those numbers in presentations to the agency's parent company on multiple occasions, and none of that history prevented what happened in the conference room. What I later understood, through a conversation with a colleague who was kind enough to tell me the truth after the fact, was that the agency had been approached about a merger with a larger group, and the larger group had done a headcount review and determined that several senior roles were redundant with their own existing team. And I was on the list because my role title overlapped with a role the acquiring group already had, and the client relationships I had built were considered transferable assets, meaning they assumed the clients would stay with the agency regardless of whether I was there, which was an assumption I had some thoughts about, but which I did not express in the conference room because I had signed the agreement and I had shaken Richard's hand, and I was not going to have that conversation in that building. The thing I had been quietly working on for 4 months before I was fired was not originally connected to the building or to the agency, and I want to be clear about that because the story is more interesting for being unplanned. And the thing was this. My husband James and I had been discussing for about a year the possibility of starting our own boutique marketing consultancy, and James had been doing financial modeling for the concept, and I had been having preliminary conversations with 2 of my largest clients, conversations framed as professional relationship maintenance rather than recruitment. And about 4 months before I was fired, one of those clients had said to me directly in a lunch meeting that if I ever started something of my own, they would follow me. And I had not recruited them. I had simply been honest that I was exploring options, and that conversation had accelerated my thinking about the timeline significantly. After I was fired, I did not wait the period of shock and grief that people sometimes describe after job loss. Not because I did not feel those things, I felt both. I felt the specific humiliation of being escorted out of a building I had given 6 years to on the day I turned 34. But I had the advantage of having been 4 months into building an alternative before the decision was made for me. And within 2 weeks of leaving, I had formally registered the consultancy under my own name, Serena Blake Consulting, and within 6 weeks, I had signed formal agreements with the 2 clients I had been in preliminary conversations with, and those 2 clients represented, between them, more revenue than my entire salary at Meridian had been. And within 3 months, I had added 2 more clients through referrals from the first 2. And I was running a consultancy from the spare bedroom of our house that was genuinely profitable faster than I had projected. The building situation began separately and through a coincidence of real estate timing that I genuinely did not engineer. And I want to be completely honest about this because the story is satisfying enough. Without embellishment, which is that James, who handles our investment portfolio, had been monitoring a commercial property in our area that had come up for sale as part of an estate settlement, and the property was a 6-story mixed-use commercial building that housed several businesses, including, on the 3rd and 4th floors, the office of Meridian Marketing Group, and James flagged it to me about 4 months after I left, and said, I think this is worth looking at as an investment property. And I looked at the financials and I said, James, do you know what's in this building? And he said, several office tenants, I think. And I said, Meridian is on 3 and 4. And he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, do you want me to look elsewhere? And I sat with that question for about 15 seconds and then I said, no, run the numbers. The numbers were good, independent of any personal history. The building had stable long-term tenants. The cap rate was reasonable for the market. The estate was motivated to sell within a specific timeline, which gave us negotiating leverage. And James and I had the financial position to make an offer that was competitive. And James had a professional relationship with a commercial real estate attorney who handled the transaction efficiently, and the offer was accepted and the due diligence. Period passed without issues, and on a Thursday morning, 6 months and 11 days after, I had been escorted out of the building with my desk items in a box. I signed the ownership documents for the property, and James and I shook hands with the attorney and went for a quiet lunch, and I called my mother and told her, and she laughed for a long time. The first month of ownership was entirely administrative and involved the standard process of introducing ourselves as the new ownership entity to all tenants, which was handled through our property management company professionally and without drama. And Meridian received the standard new ownership letter along with every other tenant, and the letter did not include my personal name because the property was held under our investment LLC, which operates under a different name, and I was genuinely prepared for the possibility that nobody at Meridian would ever connect the dots. Richard connected the dots. It took him approximately 3 weeks, and it came through a mutual professional contact who had attended a real estate investment networking event where James had mentioned the acquisition. And Richard sent me an email that said, Serena, I just heard something and I want to confirm if it's true, and I replied with our property management company's contact information and the name of our LLC, and I said all lease inquiries should go through our management company, Richard, and I wish you continued success there. And I sent it, and I did not wait for a response, and his reply, which came 4 hours later and which I still have, said I need to tell you that what happened was not my decision. And I said, I understand, Richard, and I said your lease terms are unchanged, and I said have a good evening, and I did not reply again. What I want you to take from this is not the building ownership specifically, even though I understand why that detail lands the way it does. What I want you to take from it is the thing that was already in motion before any of this happened, which is that I had spent 6 years being the most important revenue driver in a building while being treated as a replaceable component of a larger machine, and I had been building an exit that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with knowing my own value clearly enough to act on it, and the building came after, and the building is genuinely satisfying. And I am not going to pretend otherwise, but the consultancy and the clients and the knowledge that two of the people Meridian assumed would stay actually came with me is the real story. And the building is just the ending that the story happened to get. And I think it is a pretty good ending, and I think Richard does too.